What is the First Amendment and why is it important, especially to journalists? Hi, I'm Madeline, and I'm a journalism and religious studies double major at Arizona State University. Before we can understand the First Amendment, we have to understand how it came to be. The U.S. Constitution was drafted by the founders at the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia from May through September 1787. On September 12th, George Mason, who had written the Virginia Declaration of Rights, suggested that a Bill of Rights should be included in the final federal constitution. His fellow delegates absolutely despised the idea, and every single state delegation voted against one's inclusion. But when Thomas Jefferson, who was serving as ambassador to France at the time, received a copy of the Constitution that did not include a Bill of Rights, he was furious and wrote angrily to James Madison. The next step in the process of adopting our Constitution was that it was sent to each state's legislative body for ratification, or approval. More and more states began to object to the lack of a Bill of Rights included in the document. So, the delegates started to promise that once the Constitution was approved, they would quickly add one as a set of amendments. Thus, the Bill of Rights was born. Based on the Virginia Declaration of Rights, James Madison drafted the Bill of Rights to include the necessary protections at the federal level. The founders believed that the rights included in such a federal document would only belong to things at the federal level, such as court cases or laws passed. Any other rights were to be protected at the state level. The first set of rights included in the Bill of Rights became known as the First Amendment, and it states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Journalism is the only occupation expressly protected by the U.S. Constitution. This is because the founders wanted to make sure that the press was allowed to publish dissenting opinions from ordinary Americans, as well as anyone from any side of the political spectrum in any leadership role. Of course, the freedom of the press has been challenged over the years, such as the Sedition Act of 1789, which allowed those who criticized John Adams' administration to be deported, fined, or imprisoned. Laws like these were overturned or let expire, though, because the Supreme Court generally rules them to be in violation of the First Amendment.
My name is Christina Leonard. I'm the executive editor of Cronkite News. The question is, why is the First Amendment important to us? I think the obvious answer is that the First Amendment is what our democracy is based on, right? As journalists, I would say that it's important to have a fair and free press, and so the First Amendment supports everything we do in terms of making sure that we have the ability to hold the powerful accountable, to go do great watchdog stories, and to bring honest and truthful stories to people.
As I learned to teach the history and principles of journalism, I realized how fragile our entire industry could be if we didn't have that First Amendment protecting us. The fact that people for centuries were not able to speak out and speak their truths, even if people disagree with them, it's a travesty, honestly. The fact that people felt so suppressed in speech and ideas, religion, gatherings to be advocates for things that they felt were important. We see our culture in so many ways embracing that right now, the power and the freedom of expression in all aspects of our society.
One of the important cases recently was Reno versus the ACLU in 1997, when the Supreme Court decided that speech on the internet is fully protected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment does not just apply to journalists, however, but to every single American citizen.
Okay, for me, the First Amendment is so important, and the examples that matter to me are in the sports world, because my career has been in sports, and I think of some of the things that have happened recently that have sparked some really important discussion. And I think one of the biggest is the decision by Colin Kaepernick to kneel during the national anthem. What that did was prompt a really important discussion about the First Amendment, but also made us talk about issues of racism that we didn't talk about in professional sports before. And it really brought to the forefront a lot of professional athletes sharing their voices on matters, whether they were political or social, that they didn't before. And so for me, discussion and debate is the heart of solving problems. And I think it was because of the First Amendment and the debate about whether it's okay to kneel during a national anthem, and then also talk about that decision that really, really made me appreciate the First Amendment.
So when I think about the First Amendment, I think the first thing that comes to mind is how fortunate we all are to live in a country that has something like the First Amendment. It gives us an opportunity to express ourselves, to say things in a way where it's a luxury, especially when you compare that to other nations and its citizens who do not have that opportunity, who are persecuted and prosecuted for simply expressing their beliefs, their way of thinking. And so for me, the First Amendment, especially when you talk about journalism, you know, people have a right to know. We have a right as journalists to report. And so I think intrinsically it is tied to our democracy. I always say that journalism is truly one of the things that is so critical in terms of keeping our democracy alive. And the First Amendment allows us to do our job in a way where we can hold people who are powerful accountable. Again, that is something that we don't see in many other nations. And I feel like sometimes people take the First Amendment for granted because we've had it since, of course, obviously we've all been alive. But it's not something to be taken for granted. It is something precious. It is something to be cared for. And I think it's something that, again, we're incredibly fortunate to be able to have in the United States. And my hope is that people will acknowledge that and respect that.
So the First Amendment is so important, especially when it comes to preserving democracy. Without the First Amendment, the freedom of the press to be able to investigate, hold politicians accountable, provide information before elections, the democracy would not be informed on the issues, on the candidates. So if there's no freedom of the press, there's really no democracy. And that's why it's incredibly important. Okay.
Ultimately, the First Amendment is important because without it, there would be no protections for the fundamental rights to freedom of speech, religion, assembly, petition of the government, or the press.